This is chapter 17, The Sheltered Workshop. On the day Punky was to start work, he came into the kitchen with his jogging pants pulled up almost to his armpits. "Hey, Punk Man, give your shirt some breathing room," Uncle Bert said as he tugged the elastic down to Punky's waist. "My pants, you old goat." "You're the old goat," Uncle Bert laughed. Aunt Queenie handed Punky a shiny new grown-up's lunchbox. "For your first day on the job," she said. "You have it," Punky replied. He set his old lunchbox on the counter and tapped the picture of Jellybean the clown. "My box." "But look here, this one's got an ice pack and a thermos bottle." "You have it." "Well, I declare," said Aunt Queenie, removing the sandwich chips and vegetable sticks from the new lunchbox and slapping them on the counter. I grinned as Punky calmly shuffled the treasures in his old lunchbox to make room for the food. He had won this round. After breakfast, Uncle Bert said, "Well, Punk Man, it's time for working men to hit the road." "Wait a minute." Punky sneaked a glance at Aunt Queenie, nestled his lunchbox under his arm protectively, and sauntered off to his room. I could hear him sorting through his wood carvings. Uncle Bert went out and started the car. When he came back and Punky wasn't in sight, he called, "Punk Man, time's a-wasting." "Wait a minute." I smiled into my napkin. Uncle Bert could drag Punky off to the workshop, but wild horses couldn't make him hurry. Aunt Queenie poured another cup of coffee and sat down. "Del Rita," she said, "Bert and I think you should go along to the workshop this morning. See for yourself that there's nothing to fear." I jerked my head up. But, what about school?" Studying me with eyes that were made up in lavender to match her dress, my aunt said primly, "Not every lesson can be learned in a classroom." I stood beside Uncle Bert's car, waiting for Punky to gather his things, and watched as men and women streamed in the door of the workshop. A huge lump formed in my throat. Some of the people were lame or had twisted features. Others resembled Punky because of their Down syndrome, and still others didn't look handicapped at all. I caught myself doing an unforgivable thing, staring, just like the strangers who had stared at Punky 1,000 times. Bits of conversation floated about as if someone were flicking the dial on the television set. "Hi, Susie. You watch Corky last night on TV? Yeah, he cute. He my boyfriend." "Hey, Mike, how about those mud wrestlers?" "I watched Cowboys, John Wayne." To my surprise, these people didn't seem the least bit unhappy. In fact, they gave the impression they were glad to be here. A blind man moved up the sidewalk slowly, feeling his way with a long white cane. When he got closer, the lump in my throat grew larger. His forehead was caved in so far that I could have laid my fist in the groove. "Rudy, oh, buddy, give me 5, said a middle-aged man in a faded chambray shirt and overalls. "Hi, Steve," the blind man replied cheerfully, reaching for the handshake. I remembered something I heard a long time before. Blind people see with their ears and hands. When Punky removed his cowboy hat and stopped to salute the flag, I watched a driver lift a gray-haired crippled man out of a van and into a wheelchair. "Need a hand?" asked Uncle Bert. "No, thank you," said the crippled man in a high, squeaky voice. With tiny hands that were twisted almost backward, he pushed a button and steered the chair up the ramp at the front door. We followed him into the building, where a circle of employees stared at us. As I glanced around the furious faces, I felt like a bug being studied under a microscope. With a start, I realized that Uncle Bert and I were the oddballs here, the outsiders. The workers kept staring as they filed past the reception desk and greeted the secretary. They moved on into a lounge area, then looked back at us and whispered among themselves as they cubbyholed their coats and lunches. The secretary didn't notice us until Punky joined the line of well-wishers and said, "Hi, pretty girl." "Well, hello. You must be Richard Holloway." "Punky." Uncle Bert stepped forward. "I'm Bert Holloway, Punky's brother and guardian. I'd like to see Mr. Reese." "Sure thing. I'll take you to his office in just a minute." Punky was chewing on his fingers and eyeballing the flow of workers, but he hadn't offered to shake hands with anybody. What was going through his mind? I felt a hand on my head and turned around to see a chubby man in overalls and a tan cowboy hat peering at me through thick glasses. He had doughy white skin, almond-shaped eyes, and a tongue that seemed too big for his mouth. Stroking my hair, he said, "You're pretty, my wife." Punky puffed his chest out and bellied up to him, saying, "Hey, you old goat, that's my girl." There was a 30-second standoff as Punky and this fellow stood belly to belly, hat brim to hat brim. The secretary laughed. "I see Punky has a protective nature, but Barney's harmless. He wants to marry all the girls. He asked me half a dozen times. 'My girl,'" Punky repeated. Barney took a step backward and removed his hat and ran his stubby fingers through his thick brown hair. He glanced from Punky to me before sprinting away and calling over his shoulder, "My wife!" "My girl, you old goat! My wife!" countered Barney as he melted into the crowd. I couldn't help but chuckle. Barney was amazingly like Punky, even down to having the last word. Punky grinned, evidently deciding he'd met his match. He marched over and placed his lunchbox and cowboy hat in a cubbyhole. "Hey, that's my spot," objected a rosy-cheeked blonde in a pink sweatshirt and blue jeans. I recognized her as Susie, the girl who liked Corky on TV. "Hi, pretty girl," said Punky, touching the pink bows and curly hair. Susie giggled. "What's your name?" "Punky." A buzzer sounded, touching off shouts of "Time to work" as the crowd surged through some swinging doors. Susie took Punky's arm, and she fell in step with the others. "Looks like your brother has already found a friend," said the secretary. "Shall I bring him back?" asked Uncle Bert. "No, he'll be all right with Susie. Now, if you'll just follow me," she said, and led us down a hall to the manager's office. "Hello, Bert," the manager said, shaking hands with my uncle. "This is my niece, Delrita Jensen," said Uncle Bert. "Delrita, meet Charles Reese, better known as Boss." Boss reminded me of Punky's punching bag clown, tall and round, with a ruffle of hair around his otherwise bald head. He said, "Have a seat, young lady," and I backed into an overstuffed chair that swallowed me whole. "Delrita's been with Punky all her life," said Uncle Bert, sitting down at my right, "and naturally she's skeptical about the workshop. Maybe you can explain it better than I." Boss settled back in his chair and flashed me an easy grin, saying, "I like to think of this place as mountain climbing." "Mountain climbing?" I said. "Most of our employees have been kept in a valley by their disabilities. We teach them to use whatever capabilities they have to climb up to the mountaintop. They're freed by what they can do instead of being restricted by what they can't." I sat flat, stone-faced, feeling small and insignificant as I remembered Rudy with his cane and the crippled man guiding his own wheelchair. We refinish furniture here, and we do jobs for factories like packing detergent into cartons and putting ballpoint pens together, Boss said. Sometimes it takes a lot of convincing to get a contract, but once they've tried us, they come back for more. It's easy to understand their reluctance when you consider that society as a whole, and sometimes even the family, underestimates the handicapped. I narrowed my eyes and looked from him to Uncle Bert. Was that last statement aimed at me? Boss leaned forward, folded his arms across his desk, and said, "Some of our employees graduate from here and go to work in the mainstream." The mainstream? Regular jobs in regular places, factories, laundromats, restaurants. Have you heard of McJobs? I shook my head. It's a program that McDonald's Corporation has set up for the disabled to teach them to work in its restaurants. I just sent one of my best employees over to the local McDonald's to work with a job coach. I pictured the unlucky person learning the ropes only to become a sideshow for every little kid who ordered a Happy Meal. It sounded like McTrouble to me. But we do more than just work with the sheltered workshop, Boss went on. Our people compete in Special Olympics, which is for all handicapped people, and we train on Saturdays. Churches take turns hosting monthly birthday parties. Different clubs sponsor dances for special occasions. As a matter of fact, he said happily, your aunt, Queen Esther Holloway, is our most active community volunteer. Uncle Bert grinned at my look of surprise. He said, Del Rita knows how good Queenie is at organizing things. All at once, the room seemed hot, and I felt the blood rushing to my cheeks. No wonder Aunt Queenie thought she was the expert. She'd certainly done a lot more than I'd given her credit for. Now, said Boss, would you like a tour of the building? I glanced hopefully at Uncle Bert. That's why we're here, he said. As Boss led us toward the work area, I heard scratching sounds and a steady hum of voices. We rounded a corner and walked into a bright room where some workers were sanding furniture. The noises trickled into silence as one by one the employees realized there were strangers in the midst. Now their sandpaper was clutched in idle hands, and dusty faces were looking towards us with curious expressions. How's it going, Boss asked. Good, Boss, came the replies. Barney removed a red bandana from the bib of his overalls and wiped sawdust from his glasses. After replacing them, he grinned up at me and said, My wife. Barney, show the little lady what your job is. Barney held up a wood spindle and said, Feel. I touched the wood. It was smooth as velvet. Sand with the grain, Barney said. Everybody sand with the grain. He pointed to the workers at his table and called them each by name. Elaine, Martin, Peter, Connie, and Barney. 6. Connie's face was lopsided, and her mouth didn't quite work right as she asked, What's your name? Del Rita. That nice name. Thank you. I like your t-shirt. Connie looked down at her shirt and giggled. My sister. She not know I wear it. Boss laughed. Connie has 6 sisters, and she's always wearing their clothes. One of these days, they're going to wise up and start locking their closets. Yeah, Boss, replied Connie, giggling again as she went back to her sanding. The workers were relaxed now, and the noise level started up again. Hello, young lady. Welcome to the workshop, said an old man at my elbow. Hello, I replied, recognizing him as the general from the parade. Today, instead of a military uniform, he was wearing a navy blue jacket that said workshop supervisor. Boss moved on and stopped beside another group of workers. I've got the best fine sanders in the state of Missouri, he said, placing a hand on the shoulders of the man with the tiny, twisted hands. And Frankie's the best in the business. Frankie grinned and ducked his head at the unexpected praise. In the center of the room, workers clustered around a table spread with black plastic sheets that looked like giant photographic negatives. They're peeling labels off microfilm so the silver can be recycled, Boss said. I spied Susie's pink bows, and then I spotted Punky, seated across the table from each other, heads almost touching. He and Susie were stripping the same sheet of microfilm. The look on Punky's face was of total concentration. Somebody poked him and pointed at Uncle Bert and me. DJ Bert, he cried, clapping his hands with glee. Look, my job. Boss strode over to him and said, My name's Boss. Give me 5. Punky pumped the big man's hand, a smile, and a minute. So you want to work for me? Yeah, buddy. All right, then. It's a deal. I like Punky, said Susie. He cute. He my boyfriend. Boss winked at me and tried to look stern as he leaned close to Punky. I don't allow hanky-panky on company time. Punky rubbed the manager's belly as if he were polishing a doorknob. You're a bald head. Laughter and shouts of Boss has a bald head rippled through the room. Boss grinned at Uncle Bert and said, As you can see, I really cracked the whip around here. He continued the tour, and I was spellbound when I saw Rudy, standing before rows of rubber strips that had been cut from a tire. His hands moved quickly as he fastened the strips together at intervals with metal clips. Rudy's making mud mats, said Boss. Even without sight, he can put them together faster than anybody else. When I'd seen the whole workshop, I went to say goodbye to Punky. He dismissed me with a brush of his hand, saying, Go away. Go to school. Go to your own place.